The mansion was always quiet in the early mornings. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that made every footstep sound louder than it should. The maid moved through the long halls before sunrise, doing the same work she had done every day for years. She cleaned, folded, wiped, and organized. She knew the house better than anyone, yet she never felt like it belonged to her. She had learned how to stay invisible. That was how she survived there. The billionaire who owned the mansion lived by strict rules. His life was built on order, control, and image. Every meeting, every public appearance, every word he spoke was carefully planned. People admired him, feared him, and praised him. But inside that massive house, he was often alone. At first, he barely noticed the maid. She was just another worker, someone who did her job quietly and never caused trouble. But over time, small things began to change. He noticed that she listened when he spoke, not because she had to, but because she cared. He noticed that she remembered how he liked his coffee without asking. He noticed that she never judged him when he came home late, tired, or angry. Late nights created space for conversation. He would sit in the living room with papers spread across the table, his face tense from the pressure of business. She would be nearby, cleaning or preparing tea. Sometimes he would speak, not to her, but to the room. Complaints about deals, partners, expectations. She never interrupted. She just listened. That listening slowly became something else. He started asking her questions. Simple ones at first. Where she grew up. What she liked. What she missed. She answered carefully, never crossing a line. She knew the difference between kindness and danger. But the more he spoke to her, the more human he became in her eyes. Not a billionaire. Just a tired man carrying too much weight. Loneliness can make people forget who they are, supposed to be. Their closeness did not begin with touch. It began with silence shared, with trust built in small moments. The mansion felt less empty to him when she was around. And for her, those moments felt confusing. She had ended days passed with quiet tension, though no one spoke of it. The billionaire could no longer pretend that the child did not exist. Every thought, every quiet moment reminded him of what he had denied, of the life he had turned away from, and of the woman who had carried the burden alone. He realized that the time for reflection had passed. He had to face reality. The child's existence was undeniable, and with it came responsibility he could no longer avoid. He started cautiously, thinking about how to approach the maid without frightening her or the child. He knew that money could not solve this, that apologies alone were not enough. He had to be honest, patient, and respectful. For the first time, he realized that his wealth and influence, which had always felt like power, were meaningless in the face of human truth. He had no authority here, no control, only the possibility to do what was right or fail again. Meanwhile, the maid continued her life of quiet strength. She had prepared the child for the world in small ways, teaching resilience, confidence, and compassion. She had made the little apartment a safe place, filled with laughter, learning, and love. The child's curiosity and joy were infectious, even in the harsh city streets outside. Every day was a struggle, yes, but it was a struggle filled with purpose. She had carried the child through uncertainty, fear, and hardship, and she had done it with dignity and quiet determination. The billionaire observed, though from a distance at first. He watched the child learning to run, play, and explore. He saw how attentive the maid was, how careful, how loving. He noticed small routines, the way she held the child's hand, the way she encouraged independence, the way she comforted and guided without harshness. And he felt a growing mixture of shame, admiration, and longing. Shame, because he had failed when responsibility was demanded of him. Admiration because she had survived, thrived, and protected the child despite everything. longing because he now realized what he had lost: the chance to be present, to connect, to guide, and to love. Eventually, he gathered the courage to approach. He knew that a sudden confrontation would be disastrous. He did not want to frighten the child or intimidate the maid. He arrived quietly one morning, standing a respectful distance away as she prepared breakfast. The child ran to the table, laughing, and the billionaire saw the reflection of his own eyes in those tiny, innocent ones. He felt a pang of fear that she would reject him, fear that he had waited too long, fear that he had no way to make this right. She noticed him immediately. Her eyes narrowed slightly, wary but calm. She had lived her life learning caution, observing carefully, and protecting herself and her child. She did not trust easily. She remembered all the months of denial, the attempts to erase responsibility, the coldness he had shown. And yet, she also remembered that look in his eyes at the park when he had first seen the child. That look had been different, honest, vulnerable, human. He took a deep breath. I need to speak with you," he said softly, careful to keep his distance and his tone respectful. She nodded slowly. "Then speak," she said. "I am listening. But know this, words alone will not change anything." Her voice was firm, steady, carrying the strength of months of struggle and independence. He nodded. He knew that words were not enough. He began slowly, acknowledging what had happened, admitting that he had been wrong, and explaining that he had avoided responsibility because he was afraid, because he had been selfish, because he had valued his reputation over truth. Each word was deliberate, each pause thoughtful. He was not trying to convince her of his feelings. He was simply being honest. She listened quietly. Her face showed nothing at first, only patience. She had heard apologies before. She had felt pity and excuses from others. But she could see that this time, his words were different. There was no pretense, no attempt to buy forgiveness, no rush to smooth over the consequences. He was simply facing the truth, and that honesty was something she had waited for. The child, curious as ever, watched silently. They sensed the tension, the importance of the moment, though they did not fully understand. They continued eating breakfast, looking between the two adults, feeling the subtle shifts in mood and energy. Even in their innocence, they were aware that something had changed. "I have no right to ask for forgiveness," he continued, "but I want to take responsibility. I want to be here, if you allow it. I cannot undo the past, but I can try to be part of your life moving forward. I will respect your boundaries, and I will respect the child." His voice was steady now, carrying the weight of genuine acknowledgement. She studied him. She could see the truth in his eyes. She could see that he understood the consequences of his actions. But she also knew that trust was not given freely. It had to be earned. She had spent months teaching the child that people could not always be trusted, that actions mattered more than words, and that love required proof. She had learned this herself. And so she said carefully, "Actions will matter. Not words. Not apologies. Actions." He nodded. He understood completely. Words had failed before. Actions could not fail again. He would have to prove his commitment through patience, humility, and consistent care. And he was ready to do so. The following weeks were delicate. He approached slowly, offering small gestures of help and kindness without intrusion. He learned the routines of their lives, the small needs that mattered most, and began contributing quietly. He paid attention to the child's habits, learned their favorite activities, and listened to their laughter. Every interaction was cautious, respectful, and intentional. He realized that he could not force a relationship. He could only nurture it with care and patience. The maid observed all of this carefully. She did not let her guard down completely, but she also began to notice the sincerity in his actions. He did not attempt to control, manipulate, or impress. He acted with thoughtfulness, awareness, and respect. Slowly, she began to allow small acknowledgments, a shared smile, a brief conversation, a quiet moment of mutual understanding. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of recognition. The child, meanwhile, responded naturally. Children have a way of sensing sincerity and warmth, and despite the past, they felt something in his presence that was gentle and safe. They began to interact, cautiously at first, testing boundaries, exploring curiosity. He allowed them space, encouraged independence, and offered guidance without pressure. Every moment was an opportunity to rebuild trust, and he approached it with care. During this time, the billionaire also reflected deeply on his own character. He saw the mistakes he had made, not just with them, but in life overall. He realized that accountability, humility, and love were qualities he had neglected. Wealth had given him comfort, status had given him respect, but neither had given him fulfillment or truth. The child and the maid showed him that genuine strength comes from responsibility, care, and empathy. He began to understand that real influence comes from nurturing life, not controlling it. The maid continued to teach, guide, and protect. She reinforced the lessons she had always valued: honesty, resilience, patience, and self-respect. She maintained boundaries while allowing room for growth, careful not to let the past define the present. And slowly, she observed subtle changes in the billionaire. His presence became less awkward, more thoughtful. His respect became apparent in the smallest gestures: how he spoke, how he listened, how he supported without interference. This period was not without tension or challenge. There were moments of doubt, frustration, and fear. The child sometimes tested boundaries. The maid sometimes questioned his intentions, and he sometimes struggled with guilt. But through these small struggles, growth occurred. Relationships are never built in perfection. They are built in learning, in patience, in consistent effort. And all three were present here, slowly reshaping the lives of everyone involved. In quiet moments. The billionaire reflected on the child's laughter, the maid's strength, and the life that had been created despite hardship. He understood that redemption was not a single act, but a continuous effort. He could not erase the past, but he could honor the truth, support the child, and act with integrity. This understanding became his guiding principle moving forward. The maid, observing him, felt cautious optimism. She had seen sincerity in action, and she valued it. Forgiveness was not required, but respect had been earned. She continued to protect the child, teach them the values that mattered, and allow the billionaire space to prove himself. Every day was a small test, and each passing day brought new understanding, awareness, and growth. Together, slowly, the three of them began forming a delicate balance. The child became the bridge between past mistakes and present accountability, between denial and responsibility, between fear and trust. The maid maintained the core values she had fought to protect, while the billionaire learned the meaning of responsibility, humility, and presence. Each day brought challenges, but also the potential for connection, understanding, and gradual healing. And so, the story moved forward. The past remained, but it did not define the future. The child grew with love, guidance, and protection. The maid maintained her strength, independence, and dignity. The billionaire learned accountability, patience, and the weight of his choices. The journey was not complete, but the path toward trust, understanding, and genuine connection had begun. The truth, once denied, was now recognized, and the lives of all three would continue to evolve, shaped by honesty, action, and the quiet power of human resilience, ever planned for anything beyond survival. She reminded herself every day that he lived in a world she could never enter. But emotions do not follow rules. The first weeks after leaving the mansion were the hardest days of her life. The world outside felt heavier than she had imagined. She had always been independent in her own small way, but now independence meant facing everything alone. The child growing inside her made every struggle sharper, every decision more critical. As the months passed slowly, and soon the maid's belly grew round and strong with the life she carried. Each day was still a struggle, but she had grown stronger too. She learned to move carefully, to rest when she could, and to eat as best as she could afford. As the days after that encounter in the park were strange and heavy, the billionaire could not stop thinking about the child, about the maid, about everything he had ignored for so long. At work, he sat in his office surrounded by documents, contracts, and screens, but his mind kept returning to the small eyes that had looked at him without judgment, only recognition. Every deal, every meeting, every handshake felt meaningless compared to the truth he had finally seen. The child had become a silent reminder of everything he had avoided, and that reminder would not leave him alone. He tried to maintain his routine. He told himself that business had to continue. Meetings could not be missed. The public could not see weakness. But each time he closed his eyes, he saw the park again, saw the child laughing, felt the silent weight of responsibility pressing against him. He began to realize that no amount of money or power could erase this truth. It was there, living, breathing, undeniable. Meanwhile, the maid continued her life with the quiet resilience she had learned over the months. She carried her child carefully, guiding them through the world as best as she could. Every step, every lesson, every word she spoke was aimed at giving the child confidence and understanding of their own worth. She knew the world could be cruel, and she wanted to prepare them for it. But she also wanted them to know that love, honesty, and strength were more important than anything else, even though she had protected herself. The encounter in the park had changed something. She noticed subtle differences in her days, the occasional feeling that someone was watching, the whispers of curiosity from neighbors, and the subtle ways people tried to understand her story without asking. She remained cautious, but she also felt a new awareness. The world had shifted slightly, and she knew it was connected to the man she had once trusted and the child who had become her entire life, the billionaire. Unable to contain the curiosity and growing guilt, began his own quiet investigation. Not through lawyers or public channels, but carefully, personally. He asked questions in private, in ways that would not alarm anyone. He checked public records, inquired quietly about neighborhoods, and observed from a distance. He wanted to know more about the child, about the life she was living, about the reality he had ignored. Each answer he found filled him with more shame, more awe, and more understanding. The maid had done what he could not. She had survived and built a small, honest world for the child. As he learned more, he began to feel the weight of his responsibility more acutely. He had thought that wealth and status could solve everything, that denial could erase consequences. But he saw now that life had a way of demanding truth. He had avoided the reality of his actions, but reality had not avoided him. The child existed, proof of a past he had ignored, and every small detail he discovered about their life made the truth undeniable. At the same time, the maid began preparing for the child's arrival in ways she could manage. She bought small items, learning what would be most useful and safest. She read books, asked advice, and observed other children in her neighborhood, learning what skills she needed to teach. She knew she could not shield the child from everything, but she could provide love, stability, and confidence. She focused on teaching them patience, empathy, and resilience, values she herself had learned through struggle. The billionaire tried to process what he had learned, but the reality was difficult. Every fact, every observation, reminded him of what he had denied and abandoned. He felt the emptiness of his mansion, the loneliness of his lifestyle, and the distance of people who only knew him superficially. The world outside, full of life, laughter, and small struggles, began to seem more real than the life he had built for himself. He realized that he had ignored something irreplaceable, something that could not be bought or controlled: human connection. He also noticed changes in himself that surprised him. He felt hesitation in public moments, a distraction in meetings, a deep-seated worry that he could not explain. He felt shame, yes, but also a strange kind of awakening. He began to understand what had been missing in his life: accountability, presence, and the humility that comes from recognizing one's own mistakes. The child had forced him to see what he had ignored, and that insight was impossible to avoid. The maid, meanwhile, faced new challenges. The final weeks of her pregnancy were exhausting. She experienced physical pain, emotional strain, and constant worry. She had no one to turn to except herself and the small network of women and neighbors who offered support without judgment. Each night, she spoke quietly to the child, sharing hopes, promises, and love. She imagined the moment they would finally meet the world together, and she felt both fear and excitement. Every decision she made was focused on ensuring that the child would enter life with dignity and strength. Despite the hardships they had faced, one day, the billionaire found himself watching from a distance again. He did not approach. He did not speak. He simply observed the child in the park, laughing, playing, learning small lessons from life. He saw the careful way the maid guided them, the patience in every word, the love in every action. He realized in the depth of what he had lost, the strength of what he had ignored, and the integrity of the woman he had once denied. Guilt and admiration mixed into a heavy emotion that left him shaken. For the maid, the observation went unnoticed, though she sensed a quiet tension in the neighborhood. She had grown accustomed to being careful. She did not expect acknowledgement, nor did she want it. Her focus remained on the child, on preparing for life's realities, and on keeping them safe from the complicated world outside their small circle. She believed in honesty, patience, and protection above all else. The billionaire realized that he could not avoid the consequences much longer. Each day brought new reminders that the child existed and that the truth could not be denied. He thought about the times he had denied responsibility, the money he had offered to erase the problem, the life he had tried to control. He understood that every choice he had made had consequences, and that the cost of denial was greater than he had imagined. Meanwhile, the maid began to imagine the future more clearly. She imagined teaching the child about life, about respect, about resilience. She imagined introducing them to the small joys of the world, teaching them to find beauty even in hardship. She imagined the day when the child would ask about their father, about the world, and about the truth that had shaped their life. She wanted to prepare the child not only for survival, but for understanding, for compassion, for a life built on honesty and courage. The billionaire, faced with the reality of observation and reflection, began considering what he could do next. He realized that he could no longer ignore the truth. He had to confront his past, acknowledge responsibility, and face consequences. But he also feared that any action taken too soon, too aggressively, could scare the child, could harm the careful balance she had built. He felt trapped between guilt, love, and fear, unsure of the correct path forward, yet knowing that the wrong path could never be chosen again. Days turned into weeks. The maid's routine continued, the child growing stronger, more aware, more joyful. She marveled at every small action, the first steps, the first words, the curious glances, and celebrated them quietly. She prepared meals, ensured rest, and nurtured both body and mind. Every moment was a lesson, a preparation for life. And the child, sensing the love surrounding them, began to thrive despite hardship, building confidence, curiosity, and trust in the world. The billionaire watched, always at a distance, learning without interfering. He observed patience, strength, and love in their purest forms. He realized that the woman he had once denied was more than he had understood, and that the child, even in their innocence, was teaching him lessons he could not have learned in any boardroom, mansion, or circle of wealth. Every glance, every laugh, every small act of courage revealed something new about humanity, responsibility, and consequence. He began to understand that redemption was not a moment, but a process. The child and the woman who had protected them could not be rushed, coerced, or bought. Respect and trust had to be earned. He had to accept the reality of the situation, the consequences of his actions, and the effort required to make amends. The world he had controlled with wealth could not teach him what he needed to learn from love, responsibility, and truth. The maid, unaware of his reflection, continued to build a life of small victories. She taught the child kindness, resilience, and patience. She ensured safety, health, and love above all else. She guided them through challenges, celebrated their successes, and shared small joys that money could never buy. She had created a protected world, one that the child could thrive in, one that offered hope and strength, despite the hardships of life. For both of them, the path ahead was uncertain. The billionaire faced the need for responsibility and honesty, while the maid faced the challenge of protecting and guiding a child without relying on anyone else. Yet both had changed. The child, a living symbol of truth and consequence, connected them in ways neither could ignore. The world would continue around them, full of distractions, judgments, and challenges. But this reality, the truth of life, love, and responsibility would remain central, unavoidable, and powerful. And so the story moved forward, slowly, carefully, one day at a time. The child grew, unaware of the weight of history and the lessons being learned silently by adults. The maid taught, guided, and protected. The billionaire watched, reflected, and began to understand responsibility in ways he had never experienced. And in the quiet moments when the world seemed still, each of them felt the invisible thread that connected them, a truth that could no longer be denied, a life that demanded recognition, and a future that required courage, patience, and honesty. He had learned that the small things mattered most: a warm meal, a clean bed, a quiet moment. She often sat by the tiny window in her rented room, watching the city awaken. Cars moved along the streets below. Children ran to school, and shopkeepers began their day. Life continued for everyone else, but for her, life was measured by the quiet heartbeat she felt inside her. She dreamed often about the baby. She imagined holding them, feeling their small hands wrap around her finger, seeing their first smile. She wondered what they would look like, whose eyes they would inherit, whose features they would carry. Her mind went back, sometimes unwillingly, to the billionaire. She had tried to block him out, to think of life without him, but his image lingered. Not as a man she loved, but as the father of her child, a man who could not deny what he had created. She wished he would change, but she also knew she could not rely on him. She could only prepare for the child herself. The city around her was both harsh and kind. Harsh in the way strangers would stare, whisper, or treat her with suspicion, but kind in the small, unexpected gestures. A neighbor who brought extra food, a woman in the clinic who offered advice without judgment, a bus driver who smiled at her when she struggled with groceries. These moments gave her hope. They reminded her that the world had room for kindness if she looked for it, even in the darkest days. Meanwhile, the billionaire's life continued in its polished, perfect way. Meetings, contracts, events, and headlines filled his days. To everyone else, he seemed untouchable, flawless. But privately, he could not escape the thought of the child he had denied. It was not something he could talk about with anyone. It was not something he could admit even to himself without discomfort. He tried to bury it, drowning it in work, but it resurfaced in quiet moments. That night, in the silence of his mansion, he remembered the maid's eyes, her calm honesty, the way she had faced him without fear, and the thought that she carried his child, his own blood, filled him with an emotion he could neither name nor control. One ordinary morning changed everything. She had been taking the bus to her part-time job, holding her belly carefully when she spotted a crowd gathered near a park. Curiosity, and perhaps the need to take a short break from constant work, led her closer. She saw children playing, families walking, dogs chasing balls. And then she saw him, her child. Not literally, of course, but she saw a little boy playing in the park, laughing, running toward a small slide. She stopped, frozen. Something about his face caught her attention immediately. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his eyebrows, the depth in his gaze. She felt a shock that went beyond recognition. And somewhere, not far away, the billionaire was driving through the same neighborhood. He had come to check on a new development project, unaware of what awaited him. He had stopped his car to give directions to someone, and when he looked toward the park, he saw a small child playing. His first thought was casual, children are everywhere. But when the child turned, their eyes met his. The world seemed to hold its breath. There was no mistaking it. The child's eyes were exactly like his. Same shape, same depth, same intensity. The realization hit him like a wave. He could not move, could not look away, could not breathe. His mind raced. Could this be possible? Was it really him? Was he seeing the truth he had so carefully denied? The maid noticed the billionaire too, though she did not understand immediately why a man in an expensive suit was staring at her child. She instinctively stepped forward, positioning herself between him and the child. Protective instinct, born from months of fear and anticipation, kicked in. The child laughed at something in the sandbox, unaware of the storm building nearby. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She would not let fear dictate her actions. She had survived long enough to know that. The billionaire finally spoke, his voice low, almost shaking. Where did this child come from? His words were cautious, careful, as if speaking too loudly would shatter everything. She looked at him, her eyes steady, her voice calm. I have always told the truth, she said softly. This child is mine, and they are yours, whether you like it or not. There was no accusation in her voice, no plea, only fact. The simple truth that he had denied. He could not respond immediately. He felt a mix of fear, guilt, and awe. The child laughed again, running toward her, oblivious to the tension. She knelt, letting the child climb into her arms, and for a moment, the world felt still. He watched, feeling something he had never felt before, the undeniable presence of life he could not control. The child's small eyes, looking at him with curiosity and innocence, broke through the walls he had built around himself. He realized then that truth could not be denied. It could not be erased. The child existed, and the connection was undeniable. He wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, to do something, anything, but the words would not come. Fear and guilt had frozen him in place. She noticed his hesitation, the way his strong, polished exterior wavered in the sunlight. And in that moment, she understood something important. He had finally seen. Not just the child, but the consequences of his actions. Not just the child, but the life he had tried to ignore. The child's small hand reached out toward him, and instinctively, he bent slightly, unsure if he should move closer. The child's gaze met his again, and the resemblance was undeniable. It was in the eyes, the silent language of blood, of connection. The billionaire realized that no amount of denial, no amount of money, no amount of pride could change what had been done. The truth had a presence, and it was here, living and breathing, staring back at him. The maid watched silently. She did not speak. She had no intention of explaining, defending, or convincing. The moment was clear. He had to see it for himself. She had spent months preparing herself, preparing her child, preparing for the day when the truth could not be hidden. And now it was here. The world felt lighter in some ways, heavier in others. This moment would change everything. The billionaire's mind raced. He thought about the time he had denied her, the money he had offered to erase responsibility, the cold decision to send her away. He felt shame, a deep, gnawing shame, but also a strange clarity. He understood now the cost of his actions, the lives he had affected, and the humanity he had ignored. He realized that he could no longer hide behind status or wealth. The child's existence was a mirror of the truth he had refused to face. And now, he had no choice but to confront it. The child ran to him for a moment, curiosity overpowering caution. She caught the child gently, holding them close, and looked at him again. "This is real," she said quietly. "This cannot be ignored. You see it now." The billionaire nodded slowly, unable to deny the reality before him. Every instinct in him screamed that this was a life-altering moment. Every skill he had learned in business, every carefully maintained appearance, meant nothing in the presence of truth. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. Not the kind of powerlessness that could be overcome with money or influence, but the kind that forced reflection, honesty, and recognition. The maid had survived months of struggle, raised this child alone, and yet here he was, realizing that he had no control over the most important truth in his life. He could no longer ignore it. The child existed, and he was a part of it whether he was ready or not. The sun moved higher in the sky, casting warm light over the small park. The child laughed again, and she held them close, speaking softly about the day, about small joys, about the simple world they were about to enter. And the billionaire, standing a few feet away, could only watch. He could not take back what he had done. He could not erase the past, but he could choose what came next. And in that choice, he would have to confront the life he had helped create, the responsibility he had avoided, and the humanity he had denied for too long. The moment stretched, filled with silence, understanding, and quiet revelation. The child, unaware of the weight of the world around them, smiled. The maid held them gently, her eyes never leaving the man who had once denied everything. And somewhere deep inside, the billionaire realized that the life he had ignored could no longer be invisible. The eyes of the child, so like his own, had spoken a truth stronger than money, stronger than fear, stronger than pride. The world continued around them. Cars passing, birds flying, people moving through their daily lives. But this moment was separate from all of that. It was real, undeniable, and it would change everything. From this day, the path could not be ignored. The consequences could not be avoided, and the truth would finally be acknowledged. He had to think not only for himself, but for the tiny life that depended on her. Finding a place to live was not easy. Her savings were minimal, barely enough for a small rented room in a crowded part of the city. It was a place with peeling paint, a leaky roof, and a bathroom shared with strangers, but it was hers. At least, for now. She spent long hours cleaning her new home, making it feel as safe as she could. Every night, she prayed for the child she had yet to meet, promising them a life filled with honesty, love, and strength. Even if it had to be built on hardship, work became her lifeline. She took whatever job she could find, often juggling 2 or 3 at a time. Early mornings were spent as a cleaner in an office building. Afternoons were filled with errands, deliveries, and part-time housekeeping for families who did not care to know her story. Evenings were quiet, spent sitting on a narrow bed, rubbing her stomach, and whispering small words of hope. Each day was exhausting, but she learned to endure. Strength, she realized, was not built in comfort. It was built in moments like these, when you had nothing but determination and faith at the same time. The billionaire continued his life as if nothing had happened. He attended meetings, signed contracts, and went to glamorous events. Publicly, he was the picture of confidence, the man in control of everything around him. Privately, though, he felt something he could not name. Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe it was fear that the truth might someday appear where he least expected it. But he buried these feelings under his routines and his pride. To admit the truth would be to admit weakness, and weakness was not a word he allowed in his world. She, on the other hand, had no choice but to feel everything. Every kick of the baby, every ache in her body reminded her that life continued even when circumstances were cruel. She began to notice things she had never cared for before: how the sunrise painted the sky outside her window, how a stranger's kindness could brighten a long day, and how small victories, like finding enough food for a week or paying the rent on time, mattered more than money or power. Her social life shrank almost to nothing. Friends from the past either drifted away or did not understand her situation. She learned quickly to rely on herself and the few people who showed genuine care. Kindness became precious. She met other women in similar situations, and though their lives were far from easy, they shared stories, advice, and support. These connections, though small, reminded her she was not truly alone. As the months passed, the reality of her situation became more pressing. She had to prepare for the birth, and she had to do it on her own. Doctors' visits were intimidating and expensive, but she found clinics willing to work with her. She learned about nutrition, prenatal care, and early childhood health the hard way, through careful attention and countless questions. Every piece of knowledge felt like armor, protecting both her and her child from the world's unpredictability. Meanwhile, the billionaire noticed changes he could not explain. Moments of emptiness gnawed at him. During meetings, he found himself staring blankly at documents he had read 1,000 times. At events, he smiled when expected, but laughter felt distant. Memories of the Maid, the way she had listened, the small kindnesses she had offered, the quiet honesty in her eyes kept surfacing. He told himself it was just nostalgia, nothing more. Yet, even as he tried to distract himself with work, something tugged at him, a reminder that he had walked away from something real. She continued her life quietly. Strangers would sometimes judge her if they learned of her pregnancy, and whispers followed her in public spaces. She ignored most of it, focusing on the child. She imagined the day she would meet the baby, imagined holding them, hearing their first sounds, watching their first steps. These thoughts became her motivation. Even when exhaustion made her feel like giving up, she held on to the idea that she could create a world of love and honesty for her child, a world she had never known for herself. Weeks turned into months. Her body changed, her strength deepened, and her patience grew. She learned the rhythm of living alone with a secret that could never be shared. She saved small amounts of money whenever possible, hoping to create some stability. She walked through the city streets carrying both the weight of her responsibility and the quiet hope that life could eventually offer something better. She also began thinking about the future. She wondered if there would ever be a time when the billionaire would acknowledge the child. She tried to push the thought away, knowing that hope was dangerous. But deep down, she imagined the possibility of fairness, recognition, and perhaps even reconciliation, not for herself, but for the baby who deserved a father. This thought gave her strength, even as it made her heart ache. Meanwhile, the billionaire's life went on with its public perfection. He celebrated deals, attended parties, and smiled for cameras, but he could not erase the memory of her face or the knowledge of what had happened. The world saw a successful man, but he felt increasingly hollow. He began to notice things he had ignored for years. The emptiness of his mansion, the shallow conversations of his elite circle, and the loneliness that could not be bought away. Every night, when the world was silent, he remembered the truth he had denied and the woman he had abandoned. The memory gnawed at him in ways he could not control. Back in her small room, the maid kept preparing for the day when she would meet the child. She read books about parenting, memorized advice from experienced mothers, and imagined ways to protect her child from a world that could be cruel and unfair. She learned to recognize small victories, like feeling the baby move or being able to eat a healthy meal, and celebrated them quietly. These moments became her lifeline. She also learned the power of silence. Talking about her situation could have brought shame or pity, neither of which she wanted. Instead, she learned to walk with dignity, to move through the world with a quiet pride that said she would survive. Every challenge, no money, no support, no recognition, became a test of her resilience. And every time she passed, she felt a small sense of triumph that no one else could see. As the months went on, she began to feel the life inside her growing stronger. The kicks, the movements, the quiet reminders of a child who was already a part of the world filled her with both fear and joy. She imagined the baby's eyes, imagining who they might resemble, imagining the personality that might emerge. She wondered if the child would know the love she was preparing to give, and she promised herself that, no matter what, they would never feel alone. The billionaire, meanwhile, could not stop thinking about her. He remembered her patience, her courage, and the way she had faced him honestly when he refused responsibility. He could not deny the respect he felt, even though shame accompanied it. For the first time in years, he questioned his life and his choices. He wondered if he had been wrong to prioritize wealth, image, and control over humanity. He wondered what he had lost by denying the truth. Though their lives were separate, the invisible connection remained. One life carried a child growing stronger every day. The other carried a man realizing the cost of his actions. They were both moving forward, but the path for each was different. One path was built on hardship, love, and survival. The other was built on guilt, memory, and slowly awakening conscience. In the small room with peeling walls, the maid often sat quietly, hands on her stomach, talking softly to the baby. She did not know what the future held, only that she would protect the child with every ounce of her strength. She promised safety, love, and truth, even if the world was cruel. Every day was a battle, but she fought it with quiet dignity. Every decision, every choice, was made for the child who had not yet opened their eyes to the world. And somewhere far away, in a mansion full of silence, the billionaire began to feel the weight of absence. He realized that no amount of money, power, or control could fill the space left by the truth he had denied. Every achievement felt hollow. Every conversation felt shallow. Every moment alone reminded him of what he had turned away from. For both of them, life continued. One struggled to survive and protect. The other struggled to understand and remember. And though neither could see it yet, fate was quietly preparing a moment when their lives would collide again. A moment that would demand honesty, courage, and perhaps a chance at redemption. Until then, she carried life in her hands, and he carried life in his conscience. Each day passed slowly, quietly building toward the day when the truth could no longer be ignored. When the line was crossed, it did not feel dramatic. There were no promises, no declarations. Just a moment that should not have happened and did. She did not see it as opportunity. She saw it as a mistake she could not take back. After that, he became distant. He returned to his controlled life quickly. Meetings increased. Travel became constant. When he was home, he kept conversations short, polite, professional. The warmth disappeared as if it had never existed. She noticed. Of course she did. Weeks later, her body began to change. At first, she blamed stress, long hours, poor sleep. But deep inside, she already knew. The truth arrived quietly, like everything else in her life. When it was confirmed, she sat alone in a small room behind the kitchen and cried without sound. Fear came first. Not for herself, but for the child. She knew the world was not kind to women like her. She also knew what kind of man he was when it came to protecting his image. Still, she believed honesty was the only path she could walk. She did not want money. She did not want drama. She wanted responsibility. It took her days to gather the courage. When she finally told him, she did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him. She simply spoke the truth. Her hand shook, but her words were clear. The room felt cold, even though the lights were bright. At first, he said nothing. Then denial took over. He questioned everything. The timing, the possibility, her intentions. His face hardened, not with anger, but with fear. He spoke about his reputation, his future, his engagement to a woman from his social circle. He said this could ruin everything he had built. She listened, just as she always had. Then he offered money, enough to change her life, enough to disappear. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the man she had trusted was gone. In his place stood someone who believed problems could be erased with payment. Her voice was steady when she refused. She told him she would not sell the truth. She would not trade her child's dignity for comfort. That was when his tone changed. He told her she had to leave. No yelling, no cruelty, just a cold decision delivered like a business deal. He said she could not stay in the house anymore, that it was best for everyone except her. She packed quietly. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. The mansion swallowed her footsteps as she walked out, carrying a small bag and a future she did not know how to face. She did not look back. Outside the gates, the world felt louder, harder, more real. She took a deep breath and promised herself something simple. She would protect her child. No matter what. Inside the mansion, the billionaire stood alone in his office. He told himself he had done the right thing. He said this was necessary. He repeated those words like a shield. But that night, sleep did not come easily. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. And somewhere in that silence, the truth began to wait.